In the middle of the night, while Jack was hundreds of miles away working at a construction site, a violent storm swept across the countryside and headed straight toward the small farm Tu Tien had worked so hard to protect. The rain came down without mercy. Water rushed toward the vegetable garden, the animal pens began to flood, and with no one beside her to help, Tu Tien stepped alone into the darkness. She dug drainage trenches with her bare hands blistering against the wooden handle of a heavy hoe. She fell into the mud, got back up, and kept fighting until every frightened chicken and duck had been moved to safety. By sunrise, her hands were swollen and bleeding. But instead of calling Jack and telling him what she had endured, Tu Tien did something that would eventually bring tears to his eyes. She hid the wounds, because sometimes the people who love us most are also the ones who hide their pain from us, simply because they don't want us to worry. Stay with us until the end, because the moment Jack finally realizes what his wife went through alone may be one of the most emotional moments of their journey. And if stories about family, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of ordinary people mean something to you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. It helps us continue bringing you every new chapter of Tu Tien and Jack's story. Thunder rolled across the countryside sometime after midnight. A flash of lightning illuminated the small wooden bedroom for only a second before darkness swallowed everything again. Tu Tien suddenly opened her eyes. For a moment she didn't know what had awakened her. Then another violent gust of wind slammed against the old wooden door. Tu Tien sat up. Jack? The name escaped her lips almost instinctively. She reached toward the other side of the bed. Cold. Empty. Only then did she remember. Jack was still far away at the construction site. He had been gone for several days, trying to finish an important job before the weather became worse. Normally, Tu Tien could handle his absence. She had grown accustomed to waking early, caring for the garden, feeding the animals, and managing the farm until he returned. But tonight felt different. The wind was becoming stronger by the minute. Rain hammered against the roof. Tu Tien pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked toward the window. "I hope you're somewhere safe, Jack." Another flash of lightning filled the room. Then she heard it. Chickens screaming. Ducks quacking wildly, not their normal nighttime sounds. They were frightened. Tu Tien immediately threw the blanket aside. She ran toward the window and looked outside. The darkness made it almost impossible to see anything. Then lightning flashed again. For one brief moment, Tu Tien saw water rushing across the yard. Her heart dropped. The animals! She grabbed the old flashlight hanging beside the door. There was no time to change clothes. Tu Tien pulled a thin plastic raincoat over herself, slipped her feet into sandals, and opened the door. The wind nearly tore it from her hands. Cold rain struck her face. Tu Tien hesitated for only a second. Then she stepped outside. The farm looked completely different beneath the storm. The peaceful red earth yard had become a field of brown water and mud. Tu Tien aimed her flashlight toward the vegetable garden. Her eyes widened. No. The water was already approaching the young vegetable beds. She had planted those seeds only the day before. If the water rose much higher, everything would be destroyed. But then another terrified cry came from the poultry pen. Tu Tien turned. Water had begun entering there as well. She couldn't save everything at once. For several seconds she stood beneath the pouring rain, trying to decide what to do first. Then she grabbed the heavy hoe leaning against the shed. If the water can get out, we'll be all right. She ran toward the lowest part of the yard. Tu Tien raised the hoe and drove it into the soaked earth. Once, twice, again. The ground had become thick and sticky. Each time she lifted the hoe, heavy mud clung to the blade. She struck again. Rainwater ran into her eyes. Her wet hair stuck against her cheeks. The wind was so strong that sometimes she had to stop simply to keep her balance. But slowly, a drainage trench began to form. Come on. She struck the ground again. Just a little more. Her palms began to burn. The rough wooden handle rubbed against her wet skin until blisters opened. Tu Tien looked at her hand. There was blood. She wiped it against her raincoat and continued. Another few feet. That was all she needed. Suddenly, muddy water began flowing into the trench. At first it moved slowly. Then faster. Tu Tien watched the water level around the vegetable beds begin to fall. A small smile appeared on her exhausted face. It worked. But there was no time to celebrate. The poultry were still trapped. Tu Tien dropped the hoe and ran toward the pen. Come on. Come on. She opened the wooden gate. The frightened chickens scattered in every direction. No, no! This way! Tu Tien stepped into the water and began guiding them toward a raised shelter. The ducks were easier. The chickens were terrified. One disappeared beneath a broken section of fencing. Tu Tien bent down to reach for it. Her sandals slipped. She fell hard into the mud. For a moment, she simply lay there. Cold water soaked through her clothes. Her knee throbbed. Her injured hand sank into the mud. Tu Tien closed her eyes. She was tired. Cold. Alone. And suddenly she missed Jack more than she had allowed herself to admit. If you were here, you'd probably tell me I'm doing everything wrong. She laughed weakly to herself. Then the trapped chicken cried again. Tu Tien opened her eyes. All right, I'm coming. She pushed herself up. Mud covered her face and clothes. She reached beneath the fence, caught the frightened bird, and held it against her chest. Got you. One by one. Tu Tien moved the animals. When the last chicken finally reached the elevated shelter, she closed the gate securely. She stood in the rain and counted them. Once. Then again. All there. Tu Tien looked toward the vegetable garden. The drainage trench was still working. The water was moving away. The farm had survived. Only then did she allow herself to lean against the wooden post. Her whole body was trembling. Not from fear anymore, from cold. By the time the storm began to weaken, the eastern sky had turned pale gray. Tu Tien slowly walked back toward the house. Each step felt heavier than the one before. She entered the kitchen and closed the door behind her. For the first time all night, everything became quiet. Tu Tien looked down at herself. Her clothes were soaked. Mud covered her legs. Her palms were swollen and scraped raw. She tried to bend her fingers. Pain shot through both hands. Tu Tien winced. She crouched beside the wood stove. The kindling was damp. She struck a match. Nothing. Again. The flame died. Please. She tried a third time. A tiny flame finally caught on a dry piece hidden beneath the damp wood. Tu Tien leaned close and gently blew on it. The flame grew. Then another piece of wood caught. Soon a warm orange fire flickered inside the stove. Tu Tien held her hands toward it. The warmth hurt at first. Her fingers tingled. Then slowly, the shaking began to stop. She could have gone straight to bed. No one would have blamed her. But Tu Tien looked toward the kitchen table. There was pork belly she had prepared the previous afternoon. She smiled faintly. Mother likes braised pork when the weather turns cold. Tu Tien washed her hands carefully. The water stung every open cut. She sliced the pork belly into thick pieces, moving slowly because her fingers had become stiff. Then she added fish sauce, black pepper, a little seasoning. She placed an old clay pot over the fire. Soon the pork began to simmer. The rich smell of fish sauce, caramelized meat, and pepper slowly filled the little kitchen. Outside, everything was still wet and gray. Inside, the house began to feel like home again. Tu Tien prepared a simple vegetable soup as well. Then she sat beside the stove and watched the clay pot bubble. Her eyes slowly closed. Her head dropped forward. She had fallen asleep sitting upright. Not far away, Mother Loi stood at the beginning of the dirt road leading toward the farm. She looked at the mud, then at the dark clouds still hanging above the fields. Someone in the village had told her how badly the storm had struck the area around Tu Tien's farm. Mother Loi had immediately tried calling. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. The old woman could no longer sit at home. She took her bamboo cane. Inside a faded cloth bag, she placed a small bottle of medicated oil and a handful of aromatic herbs. Then she started walking. The road was terrible. Each step sank into the mud. Mother Loi planted her bamboo cane firmly before moving the next foot. Slowly, she spoke to herself. Just slowly. Halfway down the road, her foot slipped. Mother Loi gasped. Her cane sank deep into the mud, but she managed to catch herself. She stood there breathing heavily. At her age, she knew she should turn around. But then she imagined Tu Tien alone in that house. No. Mother Loi tightened her grip on the cane. My daughter is there. She continued, step by step. At one point, she could finally see the farm in the distance. The vegetable garden was still standing. The animal shelter was intact. Relief washed across her face. Then she saw the deep drainage trench running through the yard. Mother Loi stopped. She knew immediately. Tu Tien had done that herself. Her eyes filled with tears. Oh, child. She walked faster. Inside the kitchen, Tu Tien woke when she heard something outside. She raised her head. For a moment she thought Jack had returned. Then she saw a familiar figure through the gate. Mother? Tu Tien immediately stood. She forgot about the pain in her hands and rushed outside. Mother Loi had barely reached the porch when Tu Tien caught her arm. Mother, why did you come here in this mud? Mother Loi ignored the question. She looked at Tu Tien. Mud still stained one side of her face. Her hair was messy. Her eyes were red from exhaustion. Then Mother Loi looked down. Tu Tien tried to pull her hands away. Tu Tien tried to pull her hands away. Too late. Mother Loi caught them. She froze. The young woman's palms were swollen. Scratches covered her fingers. Several cuts had reopened and were still red. Mother Loi's lips began trembling. What happened to your hands? It's nothing. 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 Mother Loi looked toward the drainage trench, then toward the poultry shelter. She understood everything. Tu Tien, her voice broke. My daughter. Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks. Why didn't you call me last night? Tu Tien smiled. Mother, what could you have done in a storm like that? I could have been here with you. Mother Loi squeezed her hands carefully. You shouldn't have had to face it alone. Tu Tien looked away. If I called you, you would have worried all night. And you think I won't worry when I see you like this? Tu Tien didn't answer. Mother Loi lifted Tu Tien's injured hands and pressed them gently against her warm cheeks. Tu Tien's eyes immediately filled with tears. Mother Loi whispered, if Jack saw these hands, his heart would break. Tu Tien swallowed hard. Then don't tell him. Mother Loi stared at her. Tu Tien gave her the smallest smile. He's already working so hard. I don't want him worrying about things he can't change from far away. Mother Loi shook her head. You always think about everyone else. She touched Tu Tien's cheek. But who is thinking about you? For the first time that morning, Tu Tien couldn't answer. From inside the kitchen came the gentle, bubbling sound of the clay pot. Tu Tien wiped her eyes. Come inside, Mother. She wrapped an arm around the older woman. I made your favorite braised pork. Mother Loi looked at her daughter-in-law and smiled through her tears. Together, the two women stepped inside toward the warmth of the fire.